Did I do that?
There I am.
Welcome to Ensuring Success, Providing Equitable Opportunities for All Teacher Candidates. We'll start in just a second as our LinkedIn live stream starts. Thank you, tech team, for getting that started. Again, welcome to Ensuring Success, Providing Equitable Opportunities for All Teacher Candidates, hosted by Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, or as we like to call ourselves, Branch Ed. Thank you for joining us. We are honored to have each of you here today. I know you're eager to hear from our panelists, so we're going to get started quickly after my 3-minute brief intro. My name is Kim Igwe, and I'm the Professional Learning Manager here at Branch Ed. It is our vision to strengthen, grow, and lift up the impact of educator preparation programs at minority serving institutions as being central to efforts to shift the 20% of national representation of teachers of color to a much greater percentage of a diverse and highly qualified teaching force. In doing so, we can and will ensure America's children receive the best education and support as possible. Today is the 4th webinar in our 2022-2023 webinar series. The purpose of the 2022-2023 Nuts and Bolts series is to highlight the application of Branch Ed's signature framework for the quality preparation of educators, which outlines a roadmap to create teacher preparation programs that meet the needs of our increasingly diverse student body. It seeks to build equity-oriented educator preparation programs that prepare educators to reflect, respect, and refine the value of the diversity of America's PK through 12 school children. The framework identifies 6 critical principles that teacher preparation providers can leverage to redesign their programs. 2 of these principles, community of learners and data empowerment, provide the foundation for the remaining principles: equitable experiences, inclusive pedagogy, intersectional content, and practice-based approach. Today's webinar is focused on the equitable experiences principle. Equitable experiences begin with an ethic of care and are ingrained in recruitment and selection processes, advising timely progression and completion of a project, and induction support based on candidate-specific needs. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Dean James O'Meara and learn how Texas A&M International exemplifies this principle in all facets of their program. Before we get started, I want to share a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and it will be available on our Branch Ed resource portal along with many other resources. We will share that link at the end of this webinar. We are live streaming on LinkedIn. So if you're watching from there, please include your any questions you have throughout the webinar on our LinkedIn live streaming. We'll use the chat for resources, links, or if you have any tech issues, please use the chat for those. Thank you to our Branch Ed team for your support. Use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask any questions of Dean O'Meara. We'll have time at the end for Q&A. Before handing it over to Dean O'Meara, let me briefly introduce him. Dean O'Meara is an internationally recognized expert in teacher education. He is a full professor of curriculum and instruction and the dean of the College of Education. O'Meara leads TAMU's work in the development of an educator preparation dashboard for informing local program enhancement and candidate support efforts. He is also a consultant for the Texas Education Agency's Effective Preparation Framework and a subject matter expert for the Texas Education and Training course Sequence Curriculum Project. Dean O'Meara's current research focuses on teacher recruitment systems to narrow equity gaps, and it has drawn interest from the funding bodies, including the Carnegie Foundation. He recently submitted NSF Noise Grant includes a request for the funding, the use of mixed reality simulations with secondary mathematics teacher candidates. We are thrilled to have you here today, Dino Meram. Before we get started, we'd love to know what brought you here to this webinar. So using the chat, please tell us what you're hoping to get out of the webinar today on equitable opportunities for all teacher candidates. So if you can drop your reason, your why for coming today in the chat, we would be grateful. And now let me hand it over to Dino Meram. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, pleasure to be here, and obviously just doing the sound check. Everyone can hear me. You can hear me clearly. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. We'll just give folks a little bit more time to put those questions in the chat, and we'll come back to those at the end of the webinar. As you think about, and as we're thinking about this conversation over the next 45 minutes, I'll just draw your attention again to the heading, ensuring success. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we're creating the conditions to ensure success for our candidates. You'll learn a little bit about our candidates in a minute. Equitable opportunities, and we'll unpack that a little bit, especially in terms of duty of care and strong relationships. And then the biggest challenge of all, for all teacher candidates, and this really does come back a little bit to the notion of duty of care. Here down at Texas A&M International, we go beyond, and especially in the area of duty of care, that if we believe that someone is ready enough to be admitted, we then must deliver on that commitment to ensure their success, because without that success, there's no potential for mobility. And this is really what we focus on down here at Texas A&M International. Access for all, success for all, and mobility for all. But before we get too much into the topic, the first thing I want to make sure is people understand where Laredo is. And so Laredo is located on the US-Mexican border. Some folks think about it in terms of the country song and the streets of Laredo, but I can assure you it's developed much greater beyond that story. We currently have 2 school districts combined around 75,000. Both school districts are A-grade rated in the state of Texas. We have one of the highest concentration of blue ribbon campuses per capita in the state of Texas, a #1 ranked community college, and a top 10 ranked university. So this is really a thriving educational ecosystem, and I truly attribute a lot of the success to the quality of the teachers and the supply. One of the big responsibilities we have as an educator preparation program, we're 2 hours south of San Antonio, and not appearing on the map, but just as important is Corpus Christi, 2 hours to the west. So we produce, or have the responsibility for producing 100% of the traditionally prepared teachers within that 75 to 100 mile radius. So if you think about us again, we're on the border, we're highly Hispanic. Our campus is 95% Hispanic, our teacher preparation program between 98 and 99% Hispanic, which then folds into the school district, which has similar figures. So we have a fantastic demographic match between our pipeline and our candidates. So why are we worried about equitable experiences at TAMIU? Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, we've all experienced COVID. And the research suggests that when we have crises, they hit more than most in the vulnerable, isolated, and underserved communities. And that's really what Laredo is. But I don't want to pick Laredo as this city of pity. It's actually a fantastic city with amazing educators, amazing educational outcomes. But we did need to have a hard look at our pipeline and our pathway, especially in response. And our partners have actually come to us and said, let's work together on this. In that scene or period of mass resignations, we need to start to work together to ensure a quality teacher for every child in every school in Laredo and the 100 miles around the area that we serve. The other thing you need to know about Laredo and importance in terms of that strong relationship and duty of care is that to be a classroom-ready teacher in an Hispanic serving city like Laredo, our graduates must complete elementary graduates, I should say, must complete 5 certification exams: their content exam, their science of teaching reading exam, their PPR or pedagogy exam, and then 2 Spanish exams. One, the target language proficiency, so the capacity to speak Spanish in an educational setting. Now that test alone has a 66% pass rate across the state, and a bilingual supplemental. So in addition to the challenge of a large district disproportionately being hit by COVID, we also have a very high expectation of what it means to be classroom ready in Laredo and any Hispanic serving district across the country. We also have this idea that we can't solve the traditional teacher pipeline with the traditional candidate, female, white, middle class, especially in Laredo, because as I said, 99% Hispanic. But we also have to start to look to the margins, because what we've found through our work with Branch Alliance and looking at the data is that, yes, we are attracting the right number of candidates to meet the need. Where there's still work to be done is to ensuring they come from the corners or communities of Laredo to meet the needs of those schools. So from the community, with the community, for the community. And also the certification areas. Have they the appropriate certifications so we can deliver on access, success, and mobility? So we needed to think about a multi-layered, as the definition talks about equitable experience, a multi-layered holistic system. And when we think about equitable opportunities, I think it's important also to talk about the notion of interventions and enrichment. It's not remediation, it's actually elevation. And just as important, especially during this COVID or post-COVID era, the social supports. And social could be connections and feelings of belonging to the college, but also the social adjustments that are required to return to campus, transition from high school to university, or as around 60% of our students do, transition from part-time at a community college and often online to face-to-face. So lots of transitions, lots of opportunities for folks to get lost or to trip up, so they'll deliver access without success. But we don't allow that down here at TAMU. We talk about access, success, and mobility. I think Chris's quotation here, he's our chair, and some folks may know him from the bilingual world. He talks there about the importance of exams. And I want to make it clear, it's not about teaching to the test. And at the same time, without success at certification, mobility is not a feasibility or not an opportunity. So we do have to be mindful that the pathway to mobility includes passing certifications, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the real goal here is culturally relevant, culturally sustaining language, and knowing the communities and knowing the families where they come from. And so you'll see in the framework a lot of references to family, and we take that very seriously. You can see there the picture on the bottom left. A lot of symbolism in that photograph. The tree itself is actually from Australia. It's called a rainbow gum. And the rainbow gum is that symbol of inclusion. We include all. The tree is also a symbol of safe harbor, especially now as we reach to the margins that may include families with intergenerational households, limited access to internet, limited access to transportation. The College of Ed needs to be that safe harbor or that environment. And you'll notice in the picture, there's some faces underneath the branches. That's the recognition of the wisdom of their elders past, current, and future wisdom that comes. And so if you came down to TAMU, you would see Dichos lining the corridors to remind folks of the wisdom of their parents and their grandparents and many generations that assist them to guide them through the journey we call teacher preparation, or in the Branch Alliance world, the arc of the student experience. So as I said, today we're going to talk a little bit about duty of care. We're going to talk about strong relationships. We're going to foster them or frame them within 3 areas. 3 Latino leadership principles, which we use down here. Adelante. Adelante means to move forward, to advance. it's a word Joanna Borders talks about in terms of the immigrant spirit or the new arrival. And it's not always the immigrant new to the country, but think about first generation college students, first generation educators need that spirit to continue to move forward. The second area that we'll talk about is juntos. Now, some may think of that as collaboration, but down here at Laredo, we talk about it in terms of an extended or unique duty of care. Here at TAMIU, we go beyond. That's our motto, go beyond. And in terms of duty of care, so important for ensuring success, so important when providing equitable opportunities, if we're going to deliver on that promise for all teacher candidates. And the last link relates to si se puede, that feeling of hope. Yes, we can, yes, we can, yes, we can. Because being the first often is fraught with fears of inadequacy, fears of failure. And so there's a very important role here in the relationships that are formed to reduce the isolation across the college and colleges, if you've got students in different colleges seeking certification, provide social support systems, and also promote persistence that will lead to success and mobility. So now we'll go through and I'll use some examples at Adelante, Si Se Puede, and Juntos, and pictures from our students to tell the story of how we're applying equitable experiences here at TAMIU. So what you're seeing here, this notion of equity agents, both in and out of the classroom. This is a picture from the Boys and Girls Club, local youth group. What we have to do at TAMIU, we're starting to reach way upstream. These students are in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, thinking about their careers, thinking about, do I want to be a teacher? And so I invite you to think about in your programs, how are you creating these opportunities for access? For us, our equity agents, which include our students, reach out to community, informal and non-formal groups to ensure that students stay on the track to being ready for college. Here at TAMIU and in Laredo, readiness is really important for one of the main tripwires, financial barriers. If you're not ready for dual credit, it'll cost you around $30,000 or create a $30,000 barrier in terms of tuition. Now, if you think the families that you're looking at here, some of those children will be ranging from single income households of $12,000 to $15,000 up to the medians around $42,000, $43,000. So college tuition, a saving of $30,000 could be the difference between choosing to follow a passion or choosing a path to support your parents in a more affordable way. So we use equity agents to promote this step-by-step approach. Let's start in middle school. Then we work our way up to high school. Then we work our way into pre-ed or the freshman and sophomore. Then we work at college ready, clinical ready, classroom ready. So there's steps along the way to ensure that readiness is front and center. This idea of the agents being the guides. One of the pictures that I mentioned, I forgot to mention on the blue deer, you'll see the front of that artwork had a deer at front and center. In the Hispanic culture, or the Huichol culture, the deer is the guide. And here at TAMIU, where we have lots and lots of deer on campus, we've captured the symbol of the blue deer as the guide for these future students. And our students are the equity agents that move from the university world back into the community world to ensure that folks don't get lost along the way. So as students work with students before they come to university as equity agents, they also work as our pedagogical partners while at university. Here's an example. So here's a workshop that we're looking at in the freshman and sophomore year. So once they're in TAMIU, so they're co-ed college ready, now we need to make sure that they're College of Ed ready. So they've had a successful first 2 years. So here's an example of some of our future teachers, young girl there, Haziel and Josette, with the black top and the gray top on, serving as our pedagogical partners, helping us understand what are the pitfalls, what support do we need to put in place to ensure that success occurs prior to admission. You can see in the background there, some people might recognize him, but the man with the maroon shirt, Chris Folters, he's our chair, and he's listening to Amy, who's in sophomore year, currently working as a teacher aide, and also one of the leaders of the Texas Association of Future Educator chapter here at TAMIU. So we really validate and celebrate the wisdom of our students to help us to become better educators and help us better prepare an environment that will promote access, success, and mobility. We do this on a regular basis because the needs change regularly. And so we must make sure that our students give us an opportunity to keep our pulse, or our finger on the pulse of what's needed, when needed, that intervention piece. This next one, again, in terms of equity agents, and I said I've spoken about this idea that they not only work to improve the program, but these students here are students who went on, and actually the one on the far right was the one I just spoke about, went on to compete as a teacher at the regional levels. They qualified from regionals and moved up to Dallas for state. And then all these folks in the photograph here became national champions. This is the future of teaching and teachers in Laredo. It looks bright. 6 national champions, the others placed either first, second, or third. If you think about this idea of Adelante, this for them is one of their most memorable moments today. From an idea that started as a question in a classroom, can we start a chapter, to flying to DC, and not only flying to DC, but winning national champions. It's been life-changing. And that's, I think, once you start to put equity agents in place that validate and also provide the supports, and here it was not only skill support and knowledge support, logistics support, financial support to realize the dreams, to realize that success that we're talking about. So in terms of equity agents, this idea of Adelante, you can see the community group pre-college moving forward to become college ready. The group, once they come into college, moving forward to become College of Ed ready. And this group, many now who have been admitted are working on to become clinical ready. But in my heart, they're already career ready as leading lights. Only national champions out of Texas, all coming from Laredo, something I'm very proud of. So that's equity agents. So let's have a look now at a unique ethic of care. This is Juntos. Juntos, where people coming together. Around that table, we have faculty, students, advisors, and to the left, an external facilitator talking about AVID, Achievement via Individual Determination. And there's actually AVID in higher ed. As we diversify our pipeline and look to the corners of Laredo and beyond, the traditional approaches to educator preparation are insufficient. So what we're doing now is investing heavily in capacity building, especially during that freshman sophomore transition. Our strategy is around the Wicker framework, writing inquiry, collaboration, organization of time and activities, and then reading for academic purposes. We're saying here, think like a teacher, collaborate like a teacher, communicate like a teacher. Our students will be earning micro-credentials as they become the pedagogical partners for their peers and run workshops. This idea of preparing that transition, hearing what the problems are, and we lost students and we continue to lose students between freshmen and sophomore. Some choose not to come back, teaching wasn't for them, that's okay. But the ones who want to are unable to. At the moment, out of 60, it was about 8 to 9 this year, that their GPA dropped or they weren't ready, they got lost along the path. That's what these types of activities are about. And this ethic of care, going beyond simply support to personalize, knowing students by name and need, and our students will be the mentors of the freshmen and sophomore. We're looking at a peer mentoring, seniors mentor juniors, juniors, sophomores, freshmen. So those that move forward, they reach back. So adelante, move forward, juntos, reach back and bring the next group through. Because even though we're having success and growth, we're still finding a high percentage of first generation college students and a high percentage of first generation educators. So we need to really provide that unique ethic of care. Care of the culture. I think this is one of the ideas, and again, it's an expanded photo of the picture that Chris created. And I think that's an important part. It's co-construction. We're tapping into the local talents to create meaning here. The story of the blue deer is a symbol, a guide that offered himself to help others. He allowed the youth that were out to try and bring back sustenance to the village that was suffering at the time. He allowed them to follow him and take shots at him so they could find the food that they were looking for. We do the same thing here at Tamiu. Our blue deer, our Kayo Mari, are the guides for our future educators, the young boy and girl at the bottom of the picture. We always make sure along the way that we tap into the wisdom of our elders, because it's important. Language is a vessel of culture, and so is the wisdom. And so the proverbs here play a very important part. Tell me who you associate with, and I'll tell you who you are. Find a good tree, and it'll provide good shade. The College of Ed is that good tree. Our student association, TAFE, or Texas Association of Future Educators, that's the group that you hang out. If you want to be a teacher, hang around other teachers. And then the core of that is inclusion, diversity, and equity, which is the rainbow gum. If we looked at the bottom, it's also water there, which is the roots of the Rio Grande, which is a very important symbol here in South Texas. I should say we also share the land with deer. They're on our campus, and blue is a color of education. So the blue deer is just a fantastic way to incorporate, not adopt or appropriate, but we really incorporate. And what we've found is that students now embrace their language, embrace their history, where at times was something that wasn't so much front and foremost. One of the things we're really proud of is this idea of shared responsibility. This is Renee. Renee came to us from the school district. Every Saturday, every second Saturday, myself and Renee turn up to college, and around 60 students come in who are struggling to pass their exams. Renee sits in the corridor. I'm inside that room behind that wall. So we're giving them practice tests, simulation strategies, all the wonderful things. And he's there to catch them straight after. You might see a laptop there with, at the bottom under the young lady's elbow, that's her test score. She immediately gets feedback, and Renee's catching them straight out the door to say, how did you go? In the first time, I didn't pass. No, that wasn't the question. How did you go? And Renee's this coach, this supportive person, helping them make the transition from being a successful student to being an eligible certified teacher. Being co-ed ready, in other words, having the GPA, is very different from being clinical ready. Having the certification as your entry ticket, different set of strategies. So what we've found, this room provides a sanctuary, which is really important as an equitable experience, an environment where they can learn. The classes provide the structure, and then we give the strategies and the support. So these are the 4 S's: sanctuary, structure, support, and strategies. And what we've found over the last 3 times, first time there was 15 of the 60 eligible turned up, 11 passed. Next time, about 11 of the 60 turned up, 9 passed. This semester, we have 60 in the class, 95 still engaged, and 80% are Texas ready or state certification test ready. So the word's out, the momentum's going, and a tribute to people like Renee and that unique ethic of care. So again, thinking about that from yourself, about how we're offering care. The last piece we'll talk about is relationship building. And this is Si Se Puede. It's about social adjustment. It's about relations. You'll see here a picture of a table. We have the community room. The community room is right outside my office. One thing you'll notice there, there's no faculty. This is student-led, building the group together to address issues, address concerns, assist with transition. Cassie, one of our students there, she's actually our respondent reader today, led that group, talking about some of the issues, what they're facing, what they can do about it. But again, in Branch Alliance's world, pedagogical partners can be for faculty, but they can also be for students, peer-to-peer relationship building. But also, if you went down that corridor, which has got the dichos, we have 3 or 4 other community spaces. Out to the right of that, there's actually a balcony where they can sit outside for outdoor. Down here in the radar, it might hit 100 plus. So outdoor study spaces in the shade are very prime real estate. We're turning the College of Ed into a community space where students can work in the community room or work in small study groups together, helping each other be successful. Remember, adelante, juntos, move forward, reach back. And the last piece, give a message of hope. Build the relationships. Hang around. If you tell me who you hang with, I'll tell you who you are. In other words, if you hang with the teachers, you'll be a teacher. And this is really important. Some of these students here are from the College of Arts and Science across another part of campus, but this is a common meeting place to build those relationships. Another thing we're proud of, being the international, is starting to bring in international relationships as well. So the young man you'll see there, PJ, he's from a group called AIM, Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience. And the whole mantra is fostering unlikely connections to make a fairer world. And there's strong ties there with equitable outcomes. This idea that if you can start to connect people to new ideas, new places, new faces, it'll provide a stimulus to change the world for a better place. Again, the students here participated in a 2-day workshop. It was an application process. We also provided scholarships because we invest in students to engage in enrichment experiences. It was also to open the mind. And one of the persons there, the second one, Elizabeth was a person who took this experience and then formed the bridge with the Boys and Girls Club that you saw on that first page, or the first slide, I should say. Those young children have created artwork that now hangs in the College of Ed. Those young children, there was initially 25 that were coming to Tamayu for a celebration, ended up being 45, spent the evening walking the campus. For many students, even though it was a 20-minute bus ride, never had been or never even thought about university. Participated in our planetarium, learned about STEM, played some sport, we had some food together. And my quote of the night from one of the young boys was, "This is the best night of my life." These kids hadn't thought about university, they hadn't thought about being a teacher. Elizabeth built that bridge. She formed those relationships, a relationship that she showed me a video the other day of her leaving a clinical teaching, and the children said, "Let's block the door. We don't want Miss Miller to go." So relationship building is very important. Strong relationships building is very important in that equity and equitable experiences. Relationship building also relates to the district. That's the other side of the wall of the Si Se Puede class. You can see there, they're getting ready for their simulation exam. The man at the front is the director of HR for the school district. He's sitting there helping them understand the pathway. We're now we've talked about university ready, the Boys and Girls Club, co-ed ready, AVID, and these strategies to keep your GPA up and persisting to the college. Clinical ready, which is the testing, but then we also have to have classroom ready. And so we've got strong relationships with the school districts who are also part of our extended group of equity agents, telling our folks, how do you make that transition from a teacher candidate to a teacher, building those relationships. And actually, after this, 3 people ended up working as after-school teacher aides in a special program. 1 was hired. And this, again, if you start to think about access, success, and mobility, this is what it's all about. We need to provide that situation where folks feel that there is a path for them. And there's many paths here at the Rado. You can be a traditional student and comes from high school straight through to university, have the traditional university experience. About 60% choose to go to community college to save on the costs and then transfer, and we accept all the credits. So we, again, promote this access. And there's now dual credit. So folks paid by the district of saving themselves $30,000 a year. 2 years. And they're also now being employed as teacher aides so they can learn and earn and foster stronger relationships with the campuses and the communities in their district. That group of 62 is living testament of what happens when equitable experience is provided. We had the agents. Elizabeth and Cassie, one of the first 2, they're not in this group, they've already graduated, but they went out and they were the ambassadors to recruit the students that were lost. Renee, the man in the corridor with the computer, looked for the students, knew everyone by name and need, and identified 62, 58 of those turned up because the word was out that this was working. And then our district comes in and talks about why this is important. At the end of this semester, literally last week, of the 62, 95% of those 60, of the 58, 95% are still engaged. So there's 4 that will be reaching out again, but it didn't work from this semester. 4 out of 58. 20% are moving close to securing the exam. And this is an important point. When you're thinking about equitable experiences and providing that support, some of the main support is reassurance. Beyond validation, reassurance. It's okay to take a little bit longer than someone else. Your path and your journey is unique. And we're here to support you. Juntos, we've got your back. And so here we talk about not so much your goal for when you want to be in clinical. Your goal is to pass that certification and give yourself permission. It might take a little bit longer. And give yourself permission that you don't need the perfect score. And give yourself the permission that it's okay not to know everything on the first day. You've got to spend time in failure, and it's not really failure, it's time in learning what you need to know. And these are some of the things that we work on in terms of strategies. 20% are in the process of registering exam, 15% have taken a state exam, and 25% have passed their exam. Now, these were all students who were out 6 months to a year in the wilderness. We brought them back. That's how we go beyond. That's what it means in terms of that unique duty of care. So as we start to wrap this up, I just want to go back to that first slide and start the conversation to think about yourself and your program. The goal here is to ensure success. So what are the systems in place currently? What do you need to start doing? And what do you need to stop doing to deliver on that promise? I said, success for us is important, but mobility is even more important. And so we need to make sure that there's these equitable opportunities. There's an extended and unique duty of care here. The prior candidates are number 1 and a candidate at the individual level. If we don't know them by name and need, there could be folks who we're missing out on. And then finally, this idea of relationships. The idea of relationships, especially post-COVID in terms of isolation, especially in terms of fostering belonging for those who've been away from campuses or may be from an area of the town or from out of town and need to make those bonds to keep persevering. And I think most importantly, as you look to the top of this diagram, this notion of holistic. Yes, there's academic, there's also social, there's emotional. We need to start to think about all those aspects and how we're building them in. How do we know what's working? And how do we improve on what needs to work to deliver on that promise. I think our students are the answer. I think our faculty are the answer, and our partners all come together to create this unique duty of care that's forged around strong relationships and celebrates and validates the learners that we have and the learners that we need to diversify and strengthen the pipeline. I think I'll stop there, Kim, and we might open up for some questions and discussions if there's any in the group, and I'll stop my share so we can start to see the people and start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dean O'Meara. We really appreciate you sharing all of the things that are happening at TAMU to build those strong relationships and duty of care. For all of our viewers, if you have questions, please use the Q&A or the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with in sharing those questions. I'm going to start us off with two that came in the why. Folks came to listen and just want to speak a little bit more to some of these things. So the first one is, we have one viewer who shared that they're facing issues with diversifying the workforce. They've had a drop in their overall number in conjunction to the enactment of the required basic skills assessment. The majority of students impacted are students of color. And here's the question: how can we support equitable access to teacher preparation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for that question. You know, this is one of the things I tried. Initially, I was in Chicago, and so there was Chicago public schools and diversifying in a school district where there was large concentrations of communities of color. Now I've come even further down here to Laredo, where it's 99%. And so you've got to first think about what is diversity and what does it mean for you? For us, it was diversifying beyond the candidate to the campus and beyond the campus to the certification. And so then we started to have some good conversations. This is where the strong relationships comes in. We'll prepare the students that come through your pipeline. We're in a pretty unique situation here. 90% of our students come back into the community. We've got the data, and we heard about data before from Kim, to show exactly which high schools are feeding which certification areas. And we sit down with our folks, and one of the things about Branch Alliance, and it's a great soundbite to keep in mind, we move beyond a handshake or an agreement to a huddle. We sit around and talk about this. If you want more math teachers, we need to look upstream. We're actually piloting now, actually it's in spring, what we're calling the Adelante Academy. So this is looking for students who are in the future teacher organizations in middle school to get them ready, TSI or college ready. They're committed, they're going to have access to ACT preparation materials to build that readiness. And build that readiness in the areas that we need, both from the community and the certification point of view. So this is extending the duty of care, not only to pre-ed, but this is actually to pre-college. And I think leveraging technology so you can give that personalized, all our test preparation is personalized preparation. It's not one size fits all. If you look at that notion of the skills assessment, it's about readiness for those skills assessment. Not so much in Texas, we can't prepare teachers or candidates before we admit them. So that's a bit of a catch-22, but that's where we use strategies like AVID and mentoring. So we prepare them with transferable skills so they develop the habits to become ready. So as the challenge goes up, the support has to increase as well. It's resource intensive, I get it. We've got 20 faculty members down here. And if it wasn't for the goodwill of the faculty and the use of technology, we'd be like yourselves. But what the last point I'd look at is, it's always that in the improvement science world, they say that the system's perfectly designed to achieve the results you're achieving. So start to look at that cause and effects. What's causing the drop? For us, sometimes it was cost, sometimes it was readiness, sometimes it was loss. The three big barriers, there's some great work out of Kentucky, tripwires to post-secondary success. And they're the big three that we focus on. First gen, they needed some guides. Financial, we need to dual credit, scholarships, and then readiness. We need to put those supports upstream with transferable skill and knowledge to get them ready. And I think, yeah, and the drop in numbers, I think that the last piece, when we elevated the status of teachers to hey, here's some regional, here's some of your colleagues going to state. Here's some of your colleagues go. If your football team or your basketball team's going to state, there'd be a big thing. Down here today at our commencement ceremony, the national champions are going to have their rings presented in front of their parents and 400 guests. So we're celebrating the national champion teachers, and that's something you might want to think about in terms of what do you do to celebrate the success? Because too often teaching, which is the driver behind all this success, is that forgotten contributor. So hopefully that answers some of the questions.
I love that, in celebrating our teachers. Thank you for sharing. We had another one come in, another question around if you could speak more to how we can appropriately instruct diverse teacher candidates with fair and equitable terminology without projecting bias.
Now, I think the best way to do that, and again, I can't take any credit for this. This comes out of the Branch Alliance playbook. I'd never heard of this idea of a pedagogical partner, but I really love it. We start to sit down and talk. We have dialogues. We don't have conversation with students. And I love the distinction when they talk about dialogue, you're communicating to understand. And really building that skill set of the mentor to create I statements. When I hear this is what I feel. And that really projects empathy as well. Sometimes we don't realize we're projecting or assuming. And like some good examples of that, we've got some issues with placement. And people say, I want to be placed in this school in this district. Now, in some communities, you'll be like, look, we've got limitations. You'll be where you're at. Until you hear a student say, well, the reason I ask is because we haven't got a car and I have to either Uber or take a bicycle to get to campus. You don't get that level of insight till you understand. You don't get that level of insight until you sit down with students, sit around the table, and help them understand. Like we had a big issue with preparing students to understand the whole process of applying to the college. And we said, well, what's stopping you putting these forms in? What is it? Oh, you mean we can put them in early? Absolutely, because where it was happening was at the time of the year when they were really, really busy with things happening around Christmas. So now we've worked on that. So always think about, if you're thinking about fairness and equity, this idea first, it's almost biblical in some ways, seek to understand before being understood. Find out where the gaps are. This is the great thing about some of the technology we're using at the moment. We help people identify where their strengths are to celebrate and then dream about what could be even better. Maybe that's the other part I'd probably add into this. A lot of the stuff we don't talk about as problems, we appreciate and celebrate. So we always discover and celebrate the strengths and then together dream about what could be in terms of preparation or in terms of success and mobility. And then we co-design, and that's the pedagogical part piece. And then that last important piece to close the loop, which is what you talked about, the data, the culture of inquiry and data empowerment, developing something that can help you with feedback that what you're intending to do is actually meeting the goals set out, those shared goals and shared responsibilities, which are amongst the pedagogical partners and the faculty. That's not something to, it's something with and something through. That's, I think, the way forward, with and through rather than to.
Dean O'Meara, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your experiences and your wisdom through this process. It's a journey, and I know you're continuing on that journey, and we just appreciate all of your learnings through your own journey. If viewers listening out there, if you would like to find briefs, we have research briefs or briefs on each of these for the webinar series, and you will soon be able to find them on our resource portal. We will also be sending an email when they are ready. And Dean O'Meara has, of course, contributed to these briefs to share a lot of what he has just spoken about in written format. So thank you very much for doing that. And you can find that on our resource portal. And you can find a link to our resource portal in the chat. In addition, for this series, if you see any of these principles in action, Dean O'Meara gave us a lot of pictures of this principle in action. We would love to see it happening, these pictures and how they're happening for you in your area. So if you see any of the principles in action, please use the Branch Ed Framework hashtag, as well as the 6 principles hashtag to share it with us on social media. We would love to see how you are applying the framework in action, and we hope to feature those in our last of the webinar series. And our next webinar series, we're going to take a bit of a break until February so everyone can enjoy the holidays. But our next webinar is on February 1st, 12 to 1 Central, 1 to 2 Eastern, and it will be on successful learning, a deep dive into inclusive pedagogy. We hope to see you there. You can either use the QR code on the screen, or there is a link in the chat to sign up. So can't wait to see you there on February 1st. Last, we would love to hear about your experience today through a poll. The poll should come up on your screen now. And if you can just answer that quick poll to tell us how your experience was today. Thank you so much. I see folks are answering that. We appreciate your time today. Appreciate you joining us. I hope you have an excellent next part of the rest of the week. And Dino, Mara, just thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us today in the webinar. I know our participants enjoyed it and can't wait to use some of those strategies you shared in their own practices. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
I'll just bail out one first thing. People are asking about the Blue Deer, so I just dropped a link into. You can hear more about that, the story, etc. And just one thing to always keep pondering: our current solutions aren't solving the problem. So how do we start to diversify the pipeline, and then can deliver on that promise of access, success, and mobility? Equitable experience is a way forward. Love to collaborate with you on that. So thank you again, Kim and Susie as well. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.